Yes, our final speaker of this session is Dr. David Francis. He's going to kind of do an overview, and I think there's some competition going on with Doug because he says he's going to do 30 years in 12 minutes, not just 20.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Rick, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite. As mentioned, yes, I am going to try and cover quite a lot of ground here this morning, and I think I'm quite well placed because both Artur and Doug have filled in quite a lot of information for you. And what I'm going to attempt to do, if I can find the clicker, is fill in some of the gaps. Yes, so my name's David Francis. I'm an academic from Deakin University in Australia, and my background, of course, is in looking at sustainable feeds. So to set the scene, where have we been and where are we heading? The first thing I thought here, well, what does the research landscape, or what has the research landscape looked like historically over the past 30 or so years? So the first thing that I set out to do was an ISI Web of Knowledge search using the terms fish oil replacement and aquaculture. Not going into too much detail, not vetting the articles overly, but just to paint a picture, this is what has occurred over the last 30 or so years as far as the research is concerned. So I think we all recognise, being here today, that there is a clear need for research, and this has been driven by a variety of different mechanisms. Going all the way back to the start, we see that the first of these mechanisms wasn't so much from a sustainability perspective, but from an economic perspective, where around about the year 2000 we had El Nino events, which impacted the price of what is a finite and limited resource. To break that down further, what I've got here in the graph behind me is aquaculture production over the last 30 years, coupled with the production of both fish meal and fish oil. And what we can see is that these two resources have been quite static over that amount of time, but what has also happened, and I think driven by a lot of the research which has been conducted, is that aquaculture has continued to grow despite being restricted by this limitation in resources. Now, admittedly, this growth has come from a variety of different species, some of which do not contain huge amounts of fish meal and fish oil in their diets, but nonetheless, I think that this research has facilitated this growth. So as a result, we've really seen a huge increase in research driven by some fairly large EU-funded projects beginning around about 2003 and working through until about 2010. And as a result of that, there's been a glut of new information which has come through following that. The growth in the last 3 years, I'm not actually sure where that's came from. I think the research field's just gained such significant momentum. A lot of people are interested in it, and there's a lot of work still being conducted, despite, I think it's probably quite safe to say that we've really been at a point where we've known the effects of substitution for quite some time and have really been sitting back waiting for some of these new oils to come on board to assist in solving some of the problems that we've unearthed. So where have we been? Well, as we've heard from Artur and Doug, we've had investigations on a whole host of different species, most of which, of course, have an aquaculture focus, some of which, believe it or not, don't. And there's been a wide range of fish oil alternatives evaluated over this period of time, and of course a multitude of research discoveries, some of which are directly applicable and highly beneficial towards industry growth, and others which are, well, purely academic but interesting nonetheless. So I thought, how am I going to best represent this? And rather than going through a whole host of different oil sources, I thought I'd do this word cloud or a word fish to sum up the main oils which have been investigated over this period of time. Sorry if I've missed out on your favourite, but this just sums up the situation. And how do we break these down? Well, we've got oils which are rich in the saturated fatty acids, as Artur discussed this morning, things like palm oil and tallow, and these are and to say that they're rich in saturated fatty acids, that's what characterises them over others. We then move into the monounsaturated fatty acids, and there's quite a few of these, rapeseed or canola, depending on the part of the world that you come from. Poultry byproduct, we've got the newer insect oils coming online. And then, of course, we've got the polyunsaturated fatty acids. And we can break these down further into our omega-3s, and again into our omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And by far and large, there are far more of these available in terrestrial sources than we see for the omega-3s. So some generalisations. I'm not going to try and sum up every result that's ever been obtained. So as I said, some generalisations, some of which have been touched upon already this morning. So if we look at this from the perspective of the physiological essential fatty acid requirement, so that's where we're containing enough EFA to prevent any deficiencies or nutritional pathologies. By far and large, I think we can say that 100% replacement of the oil sources is possible, assuming that these essential fatty acid requirements are met. So in some species, that can be derived from vegetable oils alone. In others, we need to have long-chain omega-3s, as we've heard this morning, varying in concentration anywhere from 0.2 to 1% of the diet. But if we want to look at it from the perspective of optimum growth and health, obviously those requirements are going to be higher and highly variable and quite difficult to sum up here. And that can be based on a whole host of factors, the ability to metabolise and synthesise these nutrients de novo, other factors relating to the environmental conditions and the extent of the amount of lipid contained within the diet. So as we've heard, one of the biggest issues here isn't with growth, it's about the major modifications to the fatty acid composition of the fillet to reflect out of the diet. I don't know how many times I've tried to reword this differently, and I see it all the time, but this is what we see time and time again when we're feeding sources which are lacking in long-chain omega-3. So in other words, if you feed an oil source which doesn't have those fatty acids available, you're going to see that mirrored within the flesh. As Doug already highlighted, and this is his work from Sterling, what we've seen as a result over the years is that the concentrations of long-chain omega-3s have decreased with the increase in fish oil substitution. So the more vegetable oil we put in, the lower concentrations of these nutrients that we're going to find. And in the case of Scottish salmon, it's not so bad because when we look at it from both the Norwegian and the Australian perspectives, we see that fish oil substitution has been driven even further, where we're seeing lower concentrations than what was reported within that initial study. But what we can say as a result of these types of activities is that we've been able to facilitate further growth within the industry, which wouldn't have been possible if we maintained the same level of fish oil that we used historically 15, 20 years ago. And we have gained some novel insights. As we heard from Arthur this morning, some lipid sources do permit a more judicious use of fish oil within the diet. And in particular, that was what we referred to as omega-3, long-chain omega-3 sparing effect. And that was evoked when we fed lipid sources which were rich in both saturated fatty acids and monounsaturated fatty acids, but to a little bit of a lesser extent. What was also reported was that some fish possess the ability to produce their own long-chain fatty acids if they were supplied particular precursor fatty acid within the diet. Now, I was a bit of a romantic on this topic, and I know there's a couple of others out there as well, where I thought that maybe this could be a possible mechanism to stave off the issues that we saw with vegetable oil substitution if we were able to activate the fish's own system to a significant enough extent to produce their own omega-3. But that dream died a little while ago. And while this capability is present, particularly in species like rainbow trout, Atlantic salmon, it's very limited in marine species, and it is insufficient to compensate for diets which are formulated with low levels of fish oil. So back to the drawing board. Here we are back again. So that's not to say that these vegetable oil sources aren't useful, because they are a very good source of energy. But I think it's quite clear to say that there's really only a few contenders when we want to talk about making sure that fish farmed into the future are going to contain the levels of long-chain omega-3 which we're looking for. And I think that we can probably get rid of another couple off the list here as far as the alternatives are concern, because really, when we look at krill and copepod oils, I think we couple them in with the fish oil supply, which again is finite. So I'm just going to finish off by really summing up what the available alternatives are. We've got our biomasses, which are sources of DHA for the most part, and they're in a biomass, so they contain protein, there's carbohydrates and ash. What do we see when we replace them in the diets? Well, we get that in the fish flesh. But these sources, can really only be used to a limited extent, given that they are biomasses. If they're included at too high a concentration, we do see issues with digestibility of the feeds. So really that leaves us with the long-chain omega-3 oils, which Doug summed up quite nicely. We're going to hear some presentations later on this afternoon where I'm sure that some detail will be given on these ones as well. But I think we're in good hands, we're in safe hands, because all the research which is done up to this point in time shows that what you feed the fish is reflected. So to sum up, future recommendations and challenges. Obviously, how do individual long-chain fatty acids vary in their nutritional value? So oils which are rich in EPA plus DHA and even arachidonic acid versus those containing DHA alone. How do we best use these substitutes, which is a point that Doug touched on earlier? How do we include them? Managing the consumer perceptions, particularly those surrounding the GM oils. And then last not but least, how do we meet the economy of scale, which we're going to need to make sure that aquaculture can continue to grow in a sustainable manner and feed the growing world population. So with that, I'll end it, and thank you for your time.